The Australian government will make a second attempt today to pass new laws penalizing hate speech after failing on Monday to gather enough support. The laws were bundled with legislation on gun control in response to last month's terror attack at Bondi Beach, which left 15 people dead. Bloomberg's Paul Allen joins us now with more. Paul, why was the government not able to get this done on Monday?
Yeah, you mentioned the lack of support there, and it's important to remember while the government does have a handy majority in the lower house, in the Senate, it's a different story. It does need the support of the Greens or the Liberal National Coalition to get things done. So that support wasn't there. Now, there are a number of things in this bill that couldn't get the support, among them this idea of the criminalisation of the promotion of hatred. And there was a whole discussion over what does hatred mean. The interpretation was too subjective. Also, that first draft had a big focus on racial vilification. The Greens felt that created a hierarchy of protections, leaving out other groups like religious, disabled groups, or discrimination based on sexual orientation. So that was removed as well. There was also a loophole there that offered a narrow defence for religious leaders quoting religious texts. Now, Jewish groups feared that could create an exploitative loophole for hate preachers as well. There was another aspect to it where the Home Affairs Minister could designate organisations as illegal hate groups, and that was seen as potentially curbing free speech or as overreach as well. There was just an overall sense that this was very rushed, so it went back for more negotiation. So a refreshed version is coming to the House today.
So, Paul, what does then the new bill contain? Will it get passed today?
Yeah, it has a much better chance today. A lot of those contentious elements were removed. There was also a toughened penalty for religious or spiritual leaders who do advocate violence. There would be a 10 to 12-year prison sentence for that as well. Also, the gun control laws that were bundled up with this bill have been stripped out, and there will be a separate vote on that held this morning. But we understand there were lengthy talks yesterday afternoon and into the evening between the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and the opposition leader, Susan Lee. So an agreement was reached there, but even though there's still no agreement in the Liberal Party caucus, so we could see a number of members crossing the floor when this does eventually come to the vote this afternoon. But the government now bringing it back, confident that they've got a deal, and this time they've got the numbers.
Paul, thank you so much. Paul Allen in Sydney. Turning now to Australia's ties with the US. They remain deep, anchored by trillions of dollars in trade and investment, as well as the AUKUS Security Pact. But tariffs, shifting supply chains, these are testing the partnership as geopolitical factors reshape economic and defense alliances. Joining us now is Arthur Sinodinos, who previously served as the Australian ambassador to the US. Ambassador, great to see you. Talk to us first about the state of play with the relations between the US and Australia, and perhaps beyond the economic priorities, security arrangements as well. How reliable a partner does Australia see the US against the backdrop of everything we've seen with Greenland and potentially with NATO as well?
Well, Avril, great to be on the program. I mean, the US has indicated through the national security strategy and through other pronouncements from the president and others, the focus that they have on the Indo-Pacific and on being, if you like, a balancing power in the Indo-Pacific. So I see that commitment to the security in the Indo-Pacific and the alliance with Australia to be as strong as it has ever been. I know there are questions being raised about the role of the US in multilateral situations and in alliances, particularly with what's happening in Europe, but certainly in relation to Indo-Pacific. They've been saying all of the right things that we would expect about the role that they would play in the region, always remembering that America is also a Pacific power. It's not just a European or Atlantic power.
What about, as we watch for who next will be the ambassador to the US from Australia, how much does it matter, the personality involved, given what we saw with Kevin Rudd and perhaps the way in which we know Trump tends to operate?
Well, I think any ambassador who goes there has to be able to establish productive relationships with the administration, the Congress, and with think tanks and others. So they have to be a senior person, probably a political person, I would think would probably be the best choice. But they would go at a time when the level of security and defence cooperation between the two countries is very high, and with major projects like AUKUS to be delivered. So it needs someone who has the chutzpah to be able to get their point across in the Trump administration and be able to build bridges to other parts of the US establishment, because there's so much bipartisan support for Australia in Washington.
You actually were ambassador to the United States during President Trump's first term. What would you say were some of the lessons that you could take and perhaps even apply to this second term? And if there's anything that the new ambassador to America should do?
I think, Sherry, what I got out of the first term is that we are dealing with business people in the White House, deal makers. So it's all about getting to the bottom line. We saw this with the critical minerals deal that Prime Minister Albanese struck with President Trump last year. It's all about outcomes. What are the actionable outcomes? And so if you take this way of thinking to Washington in terms of finding areas that we can cooperate for mutual benefit, outcomes that they can see clearly, then I think that's when the relationship works at its best. It is a very transactional environment, but in Washington, to a greater or lesser extent, it's always been transactional.
In that minerals deal that you just mentioned, worth $3 billion, we know that they were supposed to establish a security group between the two countries. How much progress do you think has been made on that front?
As I understand it, there's a lot of discussion behind the scenes about the frameworks for cooperation, and Australians will be represented in Washington in February when the administration does another critical minerals forum. There have already been some announcements of deals with Australian companies. I think things are proceeding, but what I said to people after the signing of the agreement is it's up to Australia to push this in the relationship, because the US administration, a lot on their plate, they get distracted. We have to make sure the deals are coming up to Washington so that they can be done.
At the same time, I wonder if you could also share your thoughts, because countries are trying to secure access to critical minerals. How would you perhaps rate the progress that Australia has made? We're hearing about how they want to stockpile critical minerals as well.
Well, we have announced we'll stockpile critical minerals in Australia, and that's important to the US because of the security implications of many of these minerals. Many countries are seeking to do deals with Washington, and Washington is open to that. But Washington has given us a great framework with this agreement from last year. So it's now up to Australian companies to take advantage of that. Export-Import Bank, the White House, the Development Finance Corporation, the Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, they're all open to talking to Australian companies about this. I sometimes deal in this sector, and I found the Americans are very receptive, but they want to get to the bottom line, is to have a discussion which leads to an outcome.
Amid all this, how aligned would you say Washington and Canberra are in the way in which they want to tackle China's economic and military rise?
I think there's a lot of commonality. It's not about being unfriendly towards China. It's about persuading China that being a member of the international order, responsible member of the international order, rather than seeking to recast that order in their own image, is ultimately in their own interest. And that the order and stability of the region, what people in the region want is for people to get on with each other. Having America in the region as a counterbalance to China, I think, is important to many of the countries in the region. They may not say it as openly, or openly do what Australia does in this context, but we speak for many in the region who say they want a strong US presence to continue, and Australia works to maintain that presence and commitment of the US in the region.
Well, President Trump wants to make or remake the international order in his own image, and with his Board of Peace, which he's expected to talk about during Davos this week. What do you make of that initiative, and what should Australia do when looking at these new initiatives coming from the Trump administration to really remake the global order?
Well, I think when it comes to Gaza, anything that can be done to take the process of peace forward and rebuild the region will be important. I don't know whether Australia will ultimately be part of the board in relation to Gaza. In relation to other things that President Trump may be doing in other contexts, the thing for Australia is to look at this in terms of how does this impact our national interest. We're not here either to barrack or to be against President Trump. We're here to prosecute Australia's national interest. And does what he wants to do in Venezuela or Greenland or other places, how does that impact on our national interest? And we have to think also about whether over time we can maintain not just a strong system of allies and partners in our region, but a strong system of allies and partners across the European theatre and other parts of the world, as well as the Indo-Pacific, so we can create a strong sense of democracies working together to maintain those democratic norms and rules that we've all come to rely on and appreciate, and which reflect deeply held values that we share.
Ambassador, it's been great chatting. Thank you so much for taking the time. Arthur Sinodinos is former Australian ambassador to the U.S. We have more on Australia ahead every Tuesday at 11:40 a.m. if you're watching in Sydney, 8:40 a.m. in Hong Kong. Plus, you can tune into the Bloomberg Australia podcast, which delves into the biggest stories shaping the country's role in global business. Find it on Apple, Spotify, or Bloomberg.com.